Okay, great. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Stuart True. I'm the director of the Trade and Investment Research Project at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which is a research institute in Ottawa, Canada, on Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. I'm one of three, well, the CCPA is one of three co-hosts to today's webinar, along with the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and the International Development Studies program at St. Mary's University. So I'm going to be co-moderating with CELA counsel Carrie Blaze, whom you will meet very shortly after this housekeeping introduction. So again, it's a pleasure to welcome everybody to this webinar, which I think is the second event that TIRP, the Trade and Investment Research Project, has put together this year dealing with USMCA disputes in particular. So the first was an expert briefing earlier this year on the US-Canada dairy dispute. And now we're looking at what I think is, what I'm pretty sure is, and we said in the post, was the first case of, say, the post USMCA or the post NAFTA use of the environmental dispute mechanism. So we'll hear from US environmental and animal rights advocates on their efforts to use the USMCA or the CUSMA in Canada Environment Chapter and the Commission for Environmental Cooperation process to hold the Mexican government accountable for its obligations and its commitments and its legal commitments and its laws to protect marine ecosystems in its jurisdiction, specifically the protection of the critically endangered Vaquita porpoise. So we're lucky to have both Sarah Uhlemann and DJ Schubert to walk us through their work on this matter. Sarah is the International Program Director and Senior Attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity, and DJ is a wildlife biologist with the Animal Welfare Institute, and they are both co-sponsors of a petition to have this matter brought to the USMCA environmental dispute. So following their joint presentation, we will hear from Gavin Friedel, the Canada Research Chair and Professor in International Development Studies at St. Mary's University in Halifax. And Gavin's also a long-standing member of the TIRP, of the Trade Investment Research Project that we house at the CCPA. So again, the event is being recorded. We'll make that recording available as soon as we can. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carrie to introduce the session and moderate today's discussion.
Thanks, Stuart, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And for those of you who are watching the recording, welcome to you as well. We're glad you could attend this timely discussion about the USMCA trade agreement and the processes that the public has access to actually hold our governments to account on its environmental commitments. As Stuart mentioned, I'm Carrie Blaze, and I am a lawyer at the Canadian Environmental Law Association. And we are a legal aid clinic based in Ontario, funded by Legal Aid Ontario. And we're a public interest group, meaning we're dedicated to advancing environmental equity and justice and health as it pertains to human health, the air, land, and water. And by way of brief intro into today's topic, so we're all starting on the same page, many of you will know that in 2018, a new trade deal was announced between Canada, US, and Mexico that replaced NAFTA. And we now have the USMCA, or CUSMA if you're in Canada, but I will call it the USMCA today just for consistency. And so as part of the new NAFTA, Canada and the US agreed to actually eliminate certain mechanisms. And one of those mechanisms they eliminated was recourse to investor-state dispute settlement for investors and companies to challenge public policy decisions. And this was a win. So for 25 years, the organization I work for and many other civil society groups across North America have been advocating for the removal of this Chapter 11 provision known as investor-state dispute settlement, which essentially allowed foreign corporations to challenge public interest regulations before a secretive, unaccountable body. However, one mechanism that did come out of the new NAFTA, the USMCA, which also existed previously in NAFTA, was the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And this is a good thing that it stuck. So under NAFTA, the CEC, Commission for Environmental Cooperation, came into force in 1994, and it was crucial in facilitating collaborations between the parties on issues of trade and environment. This was renewed in 2020 under the Environmental Cooperation Agreement of the USMCA, and the CEC continues to work on pollutants and climate change mitigation and transboundary ecosystem conservation, among many other issues. And its current structure of the Commission on Environmental Cooperation has three main parts, just to be aware of. There's the Council of the CEC, where the cabinet ministers from the respective countries sit. For Canada, it's our Environment and Climate Change Minister, Minister Stephen Guilbeault. And then there's the Secretariat. And the Secretariat is the body where you actually provide your submission if you're a member of the public or a non-governmental organization. And that's where you provide a submission on enforcement matters if you think there is an environmental law that is not being upheld within your country. And thirdly, and lastly, the part of the structure of the CEC is a joint public advisory committee, and that's composed of citizens, and they're actually going to be meeting later this year in July in Mexico. And so today's discussion will focus on the CEC's Secretariat and the mechanism that allows a member of the public or a non-governmental organization to file a submission alleging a violation of an environmental law. And you can find this under Chapter 24 of the USMCA. And it's essentially the same process as what existed under NAFTA, with the exception of some timelines. So the timelines have been sped up a bit, so you can actually expect a more timely response. And this is a mechanism that has been used repeatedly in the past decades. And so whether it's, a group alleging, the failing of the Fisheries Act in Canada because of discharges of pollutants to waters in the St. Lawrence River here in Ontario, or in 2006, groups alleged that Canada, again, was failing to uphold protections for endangered species. Factual records can be created by the CEC in response to these alleged violations of environmental law. However, in promoting the use of the CEC and this factual record process, unfortunately, it doesn't assign blame or it doesn't find fault. It's essentially a fact-finding mission, but it's also good at promoting information. So then members of the public can come to their own conclusions regarding the effectiveness of these laws and the upholding of these environmental commitments. So it's more of a fact-finding procedure than a dispute resolution mechanism, but it is a tool that we have within environmental law to actually hold governments to account, and it's a public mechanism. And so I can pop it in the chat box, but there is a tracker on the CEC's website where you can actually track, submissions that have gone in, how they're being responded to by the parties, and at what stage in their status. And so today, we're very, very pleased to be joined by an esteemed panel to discuss the CEC's Secretariat's very recent decision regarding the Vaquita porpoise, which is the world's smallest and rarest marine mammal in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Gulf of California and Mexico. And the CEC recently decided that it does warrant the preparation of a factual record to explore the factors contributing to the species' near extinction. And so DJ and Sarah's groups who join us today were among those who provided this submission to the CEC, and we're very pleased they could join us today. You are welcome to ask questions throughout in the chat box, but we will pause answers to the end. Following DJ and Sarah's presentations, and Gavin as well, we will open the floor for more discussion and questions. So please join me in welcoming DJ, Sarah, and Gavin. And with that, I will turn it over to DJ and Sarah.
Thank you very much, Carrie. I'm going to share my screen. Is the screen up? Super. Thank you very much. Well, I appreciate everyone attending this webinar, and I want to thank Stuart, Carrie, and Gavin for their efforts to organize this event. As Carrie indicated, and as Stuart indicated, we're here to talk about the Vaquita and the USMCA. I thank Sarah as well for joining this webinar. Worked with Sarah and her colleagues for years on a variety of different issues, and probably since 2014 or 2015 on the Vaquita. What I'm going to do is introduce you to the Vaquita and the threats that are causing the near extinction of this tiny little cetacean. As a wildlife biologist, I am not as steeped in the law as Sarah and Gavin are, and others on this call will be. But I think it's important to provide the foundation of what we're dealing with. And I just wanted to add that if after this presentation you're angry, good, I'm glad, because people should be angry about what's happening to the Vaquita and the reasons that it's happening. And if you're discouraged, join the crowd, but I would encourage you to use that discouragement to advocate more, not only for the Vaquita and the totoaba, but for any species that you might be personally interested in that is imperiled, to make sure that species doesn't become the next Vaquita porpoise. So as Carrie indicated, the Vaquita porpoise is only found in Mexico's upper Gulf of California. You can see on the map on the left side of the screen, a sort of, if I can pull up a pointer here. This is the upper Gulf of California here. There's a biosphere reserve established by UNESCO up here. There's also a World Heritage Site that encompasses this area. And then this line here is what's called the Gillnet Exclusion Zone, which was established by Mexico years ago to ostensibly try to protect the Vaquita and to stop illegal totoaba poaching. And then the smaller box here is what's called the Vaquita Refuge. This was established in 2005, and it was based on scientific information suggesting that about 80% of the Vaquita that existed at that time used this area. And this small little polygon you see here is called the zero tolerance area. This was originally created in 2017 by the government of Mexico, subsequently expanded in 2020. And this is where the scientific evidence suggests that the few remaining Vaquita tend to concentrate. And we'll talk a little bit more about the different rules regarding the zero tolerance area in a bit. As you can see on the screen, various entities have protected the Vaquita. It's considered endangered or critically endangered and decreasing by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, endangered under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. It's obviously protected as a marine mammal under the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act, and it's listed as Appendix 1 in CITES, which means commercial trade in the species is prohibited. There are only 8 to 10 Vaquita left on the planet. And that may be startling to some of you, but as Carrie indicated, this is the most critically endangered marine mammal in the world. It's stunning to think that 30 years ago, there were over 800 Vaquita who were estimated to live in the upper Gulf of California. And what's crazy about this issue, unlike some other conservation issues that you might be aware of or that Sarah and I work on, is this is complex in some ways, but the solution is easy. We know what's causing the near extinction of the Vaquita. We know how to stop it, but what needs to be done is not being done, and that's what's really tragic. The second species that's involved in this issue is the totoaba. The totoaba, many of you might have heard that name and thought, what is that, a kind of soup? What is it? Something, a new Disney character perhaps, but no, it's a large fish. It's a very large fish, as you can tell by some of these photographs on the screen, that's only found in Mexico's Gulf of California. As you can see on the image here, the range of the totoaba is more extensive than the range of the Vaquita, but seasonally, the totoaba does go up into the northern Gulf of California, and that's really where the conflict begins, given the demand for totoaba and the illegal fishing of totoaba. Now, previously, prior to 1975, you can see on the screen that there was a pretty significant sport fishing operation and commercial fishing operation for totoaba. But since 1975, Mexico has protected the species. The totoaba a couple of years ago was listed as critically endangered by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, but a reassessment suggested that its population numbers did not qualify for that category, and therefore it was reassessed as vulnerable, but it is decreasing. In fact, a report was put out just a couple of years ago examining the status of the totoaba, and the author concluded that while the numbers are relatively secure, the rate of illegal take, the rate of illegal fishing is unsustainable. The totoaba is also listed as endangered under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and it too is on Appendix 1 of CITES, meaning that, again, that commercial trade is prohibited. The problem with the totoaba is not legal commercial trade. The problem is the illegal commercial trade. And what happens is, because of the value of the totoaba, which we'll discuss in a second, you've got great incentive for people, fishermen from the Upper Gulf, primarily in the communities of San Felipe and Santa Clara, to go out and use illegally set gill nets to catch the totoaba. That results in bycatch of the vaquita. That, as I said earlier, is the primary threat to the vaquita. You'll hear people say, oh, it's because the Colorado River has been dammed and there's not as much water going into the Upper Gulf. That's noise. That's not the issue, and anything else you hear, that's not the issue that's causing the near extinction of the vaquita. It's bycatch. It's bycatch as a result of illegal fishing for shrimp and totoaba. And it's the totoaba swim bladders, the part of the totoaba that allows it to have buoyancy, that is of considerable demand, and that's the incentive that people have to go out and set these illegal nets. The shrimp, if you combine the illegal shrimp and the totoaba season, it usually runs from late September to late April. So around now, the totoaba season should be concluding. The problem is totoaba, don't have a regular schedule. If they remain in the Upper Gulf into May, then the season continues and the vaquita continue to be threatened by bycatch illegal gill nets. So the totoaba, as I said, it's the maws, it's the swim bladders or maws that are of immense value. Totoaba poaching is a low risk, high reward endeavor. Low risk because the chances of you being caught, of you being arrested, of you being prosecuted, of you being convicted and sent to prison is pretty low. And a high reward because, as indicated on the screen, of the immense value of a single maw. Now, what you see on the screen are various pictures of totoaba maws. The picture here, the second picture here, this is what you would find in a fish market or a fish shop in China. Just case after case after case full of maws. Now, these are not all totoaba maws. In fact, there's an increasing demand for maws of all species. And so what's happening to the totoaba in terms of its persecution for its swim bladders is starting to happen to a variety of other species. And in fact, the IUCN at its recent Conservation Congress a few months ago passed a resolution seeking to explore in greater detail the maw trade in general. The totoaba is sort of the poster child of the maw trade, but it's clear that other large fish species are starting to be exploited and overexploited for the maws. Now the maws, as indicated here, stunningly, and this is probably the peak of the value. This was from several years ago. So the value of the maw, of course, fluctuates. It goes up, it goes down depending on demand and supply. But because it's so valuable, totoaba maw have been considered aquatic cocaine. The maws are used as traditional medicines. People can make soup out of this of the maws, and apparently some people believe it treats arthritis and other infirmities. But they also can be given as gifts and investments. I mean, if you look at China, this is not uncommon to give wildlife products as gifts. It happens with ivory, it happens with rhino horn. So it's a problem in China and other Asian countries. Now, the United States and Canada have been identified as transit countries. That means that the moths can be smuggled into the US and Canada and then exported to China and other Asian countries. There probably is some illegal use of totoaba moths in both countries. And I know the enforcement authorities in both countries are keeping their eyes and ears open for evidence of such illegal trade and illegal use of totoaba moth. The primary consumer country, of course, is China, including Hong Kong, but there's a long list of countries where totoaba moths have been seized. As I indicated in my first slide, it's easy to be discouraged over the situation with the vaquita, but the species can be saved, despite the fact that there's so few. The scientists that study the vaquita many of them are confident that if we can just stop illegal fishing for the totoaba, if we can provide the vaquita with the protection they need within the zero tolerance area and within the Vaquita Refuge, that slightly larger area, over time, the species can recover. It would be my dream. I will never see a vaquita, I'm quite certain, in my lifetime, but it certainly would be my dream that some of you who have young children, that your children might be able to someday see a vaquita in the wild. To save the vaquita, the critical ingredients are enforcement, the development of selective fishing gear, which and the development of alternative livelihoods. Now, I'm going to focus on enforcement because of the limited time we have today, but the other two are very important. And as I will discuss, not only has Mexico failed, in our opinion, in regards to enforcement, but it's also failed in regards to developing selective fishing gear and alternative livelihoods for the people of San Felipe. You have to give them something else that they can do to make a living, to feed their family, and send their children to school, so there's less incentive to engage in illegal fishing. It's really tragic just how dysfunctional Mexico has been in regards to its efforts to develop selective fishing gear. And I've spoken to many, many experts who have explained that the gear is available, but there's a significant problem with authorizing people to use the gear. And you can't just give people new gear and expect them to know how to use it, even if they are experienced fishermen. They have to be trained, and they have to be given other equipment so that they can locate the fish they're looking for, use the gear without endangering the vaquita. Now, this is a rather stunning graphic that was from an article published last year in Frontiers in Marine Science. And this sort of reflects what we often say, which is Mexico has made promise after promise after promise for the last 30 years in regards to saving the vaquita, and it's broken nearly every one of them. So you can see on this graph the decline in the vaquita over time, and you can see in these little boxes different things that have happened. And these don't even capture all of the promises that Mexico has made, or all of the regulations or agreements or policies that it has put in place to try to save this species. You know, we give Mexico credit for taking these efforts, but you can't put something on paper and expect it to work if you're not able to enforce it. And whether you're not able to enforce it because of, funding shortfalls, personnel shortfalls, or just a lack of political will, the problem is with enforcement. And Mexico has clearly been deficient in its enforcement efforts. It's tragic that the efforts made in the last 5, 6, 7 years weren't made 20 years ago. If that was the case, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion. But I did want to point out just a couple of these, particularly here at the end. In September of 2020, Mexico published a new set of regulations regarding the protecting the vaquita and trying to address illegal fishing of the totoaba. Our organizations came out and commended Mexico for those regulations. On paper, those regulations were a significant step in the right direction. But again, the problem is enforcement. Those regulations have not been adequately enforced. And frankly, they've subsequently published additional regulations that have weakened those 2020 regulations. So it's a tragic circumstance. And if I could, and it's a perfect example of, frankly, how not to save an imperiled species. Now, I should be clear that when I say Mexico has demonstrated an inability to enforce its laws, I'm not saying that it has not enforced anything. I would note that right now there are totoaba poachers that are sitting in jail because Mexico has arrested them and successfully prosecuted them. We also know that Mexico has seized totoaba swim bladders. It seized them at border crossing points entering the US. It seized them at road checkpoints. It seized them at various airports in the country. And those are all great things. And we commend Mexico for those efforts. But if you're seizing totoaba swim bladders at ports, that means you're not doing something right on the water. And that something is to prevent illegal fishing from happening in the first place. So these, and I would note that the date, the earliest date on the screen is October 2020. We could go back to 2017, 2016, 2015, and you would see sort of the same thing, massive illegal fishing in areas where there was not supposed to be any fishing. So the polygon in on these different images is the zero tolerance area. Now that area was established back in 2017, as I indicated, and the purpose of that area was for absolutely no fishing to occur, and frankly, no vessel traffic to be allowed. No vessel traffic, with the exception of Mexican Navy and other authorized vessels, as well as conservation vessels that we're actually monitoring for illegal fishing or engaging in surveys for the Vaquita. You can see from the dots on within these polygons for October, November, and December 2020, the amount of illegal fishing that was occurring in the zero tolerance area. This should not have ever happened, because at this point in time, Mexico should have had and should have implemented, should have had the capacity and should have exercised the capacity to prevent any illegal fishing from occurring in these polygons. I would note that while most of the surviving Vaquita exist within the zero tolerance area, there is evidence, including from last fall, of Vaquita being seen outside the zero tolerance area. So it's critically important that Mexico not only enforce its laws in regards to the zero tolerance area, but that it expand it and enforce it at a minimum within the entire Vaquita Refuge. In addition to the data that you see on the screen for the months in 2020, we know from a Vaquita survey that was done from October 17th to November 3rd, 2021, that on November 3rd, the boats involved in that survey did a survey of pangas. Those are the small fishing boats that are used by the fishermen to set their gill nets, and they found 117 pangas in the zero tolerance area. We also know that during that same survey, there were so many illegal pangas in the zero tolerance area that the survey vessels had difficulty in doing their work, which was to count Vaquita, to find and count Vaquita. We know from eyewitness accounts that these illegal fishing happens day and night. We know that the Mexican Navy has a non-confrontation policy. So they have large vessels and interceptor vessels that are present in the upper Gulf, but they do not engage in arrests on the water due to this non-confrontation policy because of the concern that it could incite violence within these communities. We understand that concern. We know that the cartels are very active in these communities, but we can't allow, a country like Mexico can't allow cartels to dictate what happens in regards to its efforts to conserve and protect the Vaquita. I would also note that over time, the methods used for fishing have changed. Years ago, the fishermen used to go out, set the gill net, go back to shore, come back out a day or two later, collect the gill net, find out, what they caught, including, potentially vaquita and totoaba and other species. Now, because the fishermen have very little concern about being arrested, they go out, they set the net, they stay with it. You would think if they were concerned about being arrested, they wouldn't be wanting to stay with an illegally set net. But that demonstrates just how inefficient and inadequate Mexico's enforcement efforts have been. Two more slides, and then I'll turn it over to Sarah. But I wanted to also show you evidence of ongoing illegal fishing in the zero tolerance area. Now, what you see here reflects new information that has been publicized by the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, which is a conservation group that's been very active in the Upper Gulf for a number of years. And early on, what it did is it made an effort within the Vaquita Refuge in the zero tolerance area to find and remove illegally set gill nets, including abandoned nets, which was critically important and remains critically important to save the vaquita. Recently, they signed back in January, they signed a new agreement with the Mexican Navy, which they claim has resulted in improved or expedited response time when Sea Shepherd calls the Navy and says that there's illegal fishing going on in the ZTA. And according to Sea Shepherd, has resulted in a decline in the number of illegal vessels fishing within the ZTA. Now, that's inconsistent with some evidence from a land-based observation group called ZTA Watch that monitors the zero tolerance area using giant, very powerful binoculars or other types of scopes. And they collect data on what they see from the land and compare it to what the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society sees. And you can see the blue line is what's been reported from the land-based observations. The orange lines reflect when the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society vessel was on the water. Now, we hope that Sea Shepherd's data, which we have not been able to access, is accurate. We hope that, in fact, this new agreement has resulted in a decline in the number of illegal vessels in the ZTA. Unfortunately, there are other factors that could also contribute to this decline, including the recent closure of the shrimp season, which affects the entire Pacific coast of Mexico, including the Gulf of California, and the fact that fishermen rely on other factors to determine when they're going to go out and set their nets, including whether the totoaba are present, the phase of the moon, the currents, and the tides. The second graph reflects the count of Pongo's illegal fishing vessels within the zero tolerance area and outside the zero tolerance area in the Vaquita Refuge. And while we are glad to see that the trend is declining within the zero tolerance area, and we hope that continues, you can see that the number of illegal vessels fishing in the Vaquita Refuge is still really high. And the problem is that even one vessel setting an illegal gill net runs the risk of catching another vaquita and causing the population to get closer and closer to extinction. Finally, I just wanted to provide some information about the global effort being undertaken to try to protect the vaquita. In addition to Mexico, as I said, taking actions on its own, including strengthening its fishing regulations, strengthening its criminal statutes. There are a number of international entities involved in this effort, including CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, the International Whaling Commission. I've already mentioned the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the World Heritage Convention. We're employing every trick that every tool that we can to try to protect the vaquita, because we've been told by very educated and learned people in Mexico that regardless of what administration is in power in Mexico, Mexico responds to pressure from the outside. Mexico responds to multiple strategies using whatever conventions we can find to put pressure on it to do better, to do more to protect the vaquita. And of course, as Sarah will discuss in a moment, we are also employing the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Well, thank you so much, DJ. That was a really helpful background, and I think is going to unite with my presentation pretty closely. I will know that I think we're running a little short on time. So Carrie or Stu, if I could ask you to give me a wave when I'm at the like 12-minute mark, and I'll try to wrap it up if that's okay. Great, thanks. Yeah, so thank you for being here. I'm Sarah Uhlemann. I am an attorney. So we're now going to shift to the law part of this presentation. I'm going to cover two things. First, the citizen submission process, the CEC process that Carrie mentioned under the USMCA, and then very briefly, the USMCA environmental dispute process that's a little bit special. And really how we're using both of these mechanisms right now to try to help the vaquita. Slide, please, DJ. So I think as a lot of folks know, the USMCA has its own environmental provisions. A lot of these are pretty helpful. They address a wide variety of issues from ozone to public participation, invasive species, forestry issues. I like a lot of the commitments. I will say that I wish they had a few more shalls and a few less shall strive tos, but still some helpful things in there. One of the most helpful commitments that is very clear and very strong is the commitment that no party shall fail to effectively enforce its environmental laws through a sustained or recurring course of action or inaction. This is really the first commitment in that section, and I'd say one of the most important core commitments that the parties made under the USMCA. The other article that I wanted to highlight is the article that really creates, in a way, and addresses the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And what Carrie said at the beginning is exactly right. This commission existed, back under NAFTA, and it was sort of reaffirmed under the USMCA. I think Carrie gave a pretty good description about a lot of the things that it does, but I'm going to focus on the SEM process, the Submission on Environmental Matters. DJ, if you could change slides. As Carrie said, this is a process that allows citizens to actually interact with the USMCA. NGOs or individuals, either way, can request that this body, the CEC, do an investigation and bring the facts to light. Ultimately, it can result in a detailed investigation into alleged environmental failures of the government. And you can imagine how helpful this might be, right? You have an independent third party objectively looking at what the facts are. Very helpful in this case, where we have the Mexican government really going all over the world and all these treaty meetings that DJ just mentioned, saying that their enforcement is fantastic, that there have been 2 incidents, is what the government said at the last treaty meeting that I attended. 2 incidents of illegal activity. So not what the facts say, right? So it'd be very helpful to have an independent party really clarifying what the facts are. Here's again exactly right, that what results is this factual record that doesn't lay blame. It doesn't ultimately tell anybody they have to do anything, but it does lay out what the facts are. But that still can be really, really powerful in this particular situation. So I want to walk through the process in case folks are interested in using it. And I really would encourage people to do it. It's sort of striking how few submissions there are every year. So any person can submit a submission. It's not supposed to be a legal document. It's supposed to be a citizen-friendly document. You don't have to have a lawyer write it. I'd recommend that you might have a lawyer review it. It's only allowed to be 15 pages long, so it has to be pretty brief. You really only have to identify the statute or law that you think there's a failure of enforcement on. And you must have communicated the matter to the government and pursued private remedies, which is a bit of a hurdle. I'll talk about that in a minute. And the issue cannot be in litigation. Okay. So we decided to use this provision back in August of 2021. We submitted a petition saying that Mexico indeed is failing to enforce its environmental laws, including its fisheries laws, right? That ban on totoaba fishing. Totoaba fishing continues. The ban on use of gill nets in the zero tolerance area. Again, law being, failure to enforce it, but also the Mexican government's failure to enforce the CITES Treaty. So this is the the wildlife trade treaty that prohibits international trade in totoaba. Again, failing to enforce the law there. Next step, the Secretariat has 60 days to sort of make sure you've complied with all the procedural requirements and decide whether the submission kind of warrants further investigation. And indeed, they made that decision in September 2021. After that, the party, so in this case, Mexico, has 30 days to submit its response. Mexico did do that, quite tardy response, but nonetheless, they complained about procedure, but also did what they've been doing at all these international meetings, which is saying, that they've really got enforcement handled. Look at these numbers, look at the number of enforcement officials we have in the area, look at the number of boats we've inspected. These numbers are fantastic. The Secretariat then has 60 days to look at both the submission and the government's response and decide whether there are still central questions of fact that remain open. So we're grateful to say that in April 2022, so just this month, the Secretariat agreed. It said, certainly there's some questions raised. Mexico says that their enforcement is solid, but they don't really address how effective their enforcement is. And that's going to be the central question that they're going to investigate, which is fantastic. That's exactly what we want them to focus on. The next step in the process is a little hairy. Carrie also referenced this. The council, so this is the kind of governing body of the CEC, it's a political body, gets to decide whether or not we get a factual record. Each party gets a vote. So US, think they're going to vote yes. Mexico, think they're going to vote no. Canada's going to be, I'm going to say, the deciding vote in this. So if any of y'all know the gentleman that Carrie referenced, Stephen Gabal, what pronunciation there? Please let me know. I'd love to have a conversation with him about which way he should vote. If they do indeed vote yes, it's a 2/3 vote wins the day. They will direct the Secretariat to issue this factual record. Secretariat has about 6 months to do that. They can look at info that was submitted by the parties, info we submitted, info experts submit. They can go down, they can do a mission, they can hire experts, and they certainly have done that in the past. The factual record is, can be 60 to 100 pages long, really digs into what the law is and what the facts on the ground look like. We're really hopeful that this will actually happen for us. I will say, just to flag that you can tell from this flow chart and my description that this process is procedurally complicated. There are this kind of trick where you have to have talked to the government, but you can't, and you have to have done something like petition them, but you can't be in the middle of that process and you can't be litigating, which in the US is hard because, man, we litigate all the time, right? Y'all know that. So, finding an issue that is sort of in the spot where there's no active litigation, but you have really apprised and gone through some kind of process within the country, it can be tricky to find issues that fall in that sort of gap. At the end of the day, this is a political process. The CEC Secretariat is, they definitely try to interpret the procedures to really allow this to be a more citizen-friendly process. They tend to try not to make it too burdensome. I've been involved in 3 of these. The council has killed 2 of them, has voted down 2 of my factual records. So I'm hopeful that it'll work out this time. But at the end of the day, it is a political process. This is the first one I've been involved in that's under the USMCA and not NAFTA. I hope that the parties, with their renewed commitment to the environment within the agreement and their renewed commitment to transparency within the agreement, will feel obliged to allow this to continue, but we'll see. So next slide, DJ. Very briefly, I just want to mention that there is a special USMCA dispute resolution provision under the environmental section, under the environmental articles of the USMCA. I think some folks might be familiar with Article 31, which is the general dispute settlement provision, which eventually allows parties to be able to call a panel an independent panel to assess the situation. It becomes very formal. It is essentially litigation, briefing on both sides, an oral argument, very detailed, very formal dispute process. The environmental consultation provision has a sort of consultation, a lighter dispute resolution process, where if there is a country alleges that another country is failing in its obligations under for environmental commitments, they can send a written request to the party requesting consultation. The idea is that throughout the process, there can be higher and higher levels of consultation. So first, it's like the people on the ground, the government officials on the ground, then senior level officials, then ministerial level officials, to really kind of talk through whether there can be a resolution. If there isn't, ultimately this process can get kicked into the more formal dispute process of Article 31. You can go through that sort of formal, litigation process that's spelled out there. It is two different routes, as I understand it's being interpreted. The countries could go either way. They could try the consultation provisions, or they could just jump straight to the dispute. One, I think, is probably looking at more potential punitive routes, is the sort of Article 31. I would say that the environmental provisions is more of a sort of persuasive route. So when we submitted our CEC petition last year, we simultaneously sent it to the US government and said, hey, yeah, sure, we can do, this citizen process, we're on it, this is really important. But at the end of the day, Mexico's failing its environmental commitments under the agreement. Can you take action? Can you use these provisions that are at hand? And in February of this year, the US did. It initiated the first ever environmental consultation under these environmental consultation provisions with the Mexican government. I think with is an interesting term instead of against, but that is where we're at, it's with. At this point, we do know that those initial consultations have occurred. There are a few, at least one more sort of planned for the future. Unfortunately, as citizen groups, we can't be involved in that process, which definitely stinks as far as transparency goes. I think I'll end my section by saying that when we look at these two processes and the Vaquita situation, we are talking about extinction here. It's about as serious as it gets for a wildlife issue. I think the result of these two processes is going to be a real test of how meaningful the environmental provisions of the USMCA really are. And how committed the parties are to both environmental protection and transparency. It's sort of codified within the agreement. So I will turn it to Gavin.
Thank you, Sarah and DJ. And just before we turn it to Gavin, we do recognize we said we'd be over at 1. So if you do have to go, you can dial off when needed, but we are recording, so we will send you the recording, and we will, if you can stay longer, we'll hop to the Q&A just shortly after 1. And now over to Gavin.
Thanks very much. I think in the interest of time then, based on what Carrie's just said, I'm going to skip the first part of what some of my comments were. I think that's actually really already been covered, about some of the benefits of using the CEC submission, the way that these wonderful experts have already done. And I'm going to skip to the second half, where I was just going to raise some of the contradictions and challenges that comes with using these kinds of environmental chapters and trade agreements, to sort of bring that into the discussion. And I really have 3 things I'm going to talk about. I'll try to do them quickly. One of them is, if we talk specifically about Chapter 24, so I think it's important that when we use these tools, which we should do, and that was what my first part was originally going to be about, that there are tensions and gaps within them. And my reading of Chapter 24 in particular is that if we get as far as, say, dispute settlements, the chapter itself could be read as being biased against Mexico. Now, I think it remains to be seen if it plays out this way, and if we ever get that far. But I think the main focus of the environment chapter is on enforcing existing laws. And there's lots of other commitments in it as well, which Sarah mentioned. But I think if we're thinking about if something could ever go as far as a dispute, it's likely going to emerge around whether or not a country is failing to effectively enforce its own laws and whether that failure is sustained or occurring. So in terms of the contradictions of how these chapters can play out, I think we always keep in mind that those kind of challenges could appear to be much greater for Mexico than for some of the other members of the USMCA. And I'd say that it's not as innocent a bias as it might first appear. We'll have to see how it plays out in the coming years, but the power imbalance between countries suggests if we do get to disputes, they'll mostly come from the US towards Mexico. It doesn't have to be the case. But I think it's an interesting gap to keep in mind is that the Chapter 24 does ignore those areas of the environment that are particularly concerning to the US and Canada. So as other people have pointed out, the chapter makes no mention of climate change or reducing CO2 emissions or the fossil fuel trade. And it's important to note there that while Mexico is an important producer of fossil fuels, the US and Canada are the world's third and fourth largest exporters. So to put that in context, Canada is 1/3 the size of Mexico in terms of its population, but it exports 3.5 times the crude petroleum. Canada, of course, has a historic responsibility to address carbon emissions. Its environmental footprint per capita is 4 times that of Mexico's. So I think, I can get into that a bit more, but what I think is interesting is that Canada has a global strategy that involves continuing to expand its fossil fuel exports. And that's not part of its climate commitments. So Mark Lee, a senior economist at the CCPA, has estimated that if that was part of Canada's climate commitments, our fossil fuel extraction would be considered twice as high as it currently is. So a lot more can be said on this, which obviously I'm not going to get into, but I think my key point is, in terms of thinking of some of the contradictions and challenges, is that the environmental chapter, I would argue, could be read as being biased against Mexico, which over time and into the future could increase the hostility of Mexico toward that environmental chapter. And I think that's something for us to think about. A second contradiction or challenge is to think more generally about environmental chapters and trade agreements. And one thing we always should keep in mind is that they don't really look at the negative environmental impacts that are caused every day by global trade. So I think the situation of the Vaquita and the totoaba is very distinct from other cases. At the same time, it could also be looked at as part of global trends towards overfishing. And and overfishing is intensified by global trade. It sparks competition between fisheries. They keep adopting more sophisticated methods and technology to expand their reach and travel deeper into the ocean and catch more fish, often to feed a growing global market for cheap fish, which is not the case with the totoaba, as we've learned. But according to the FAO, only 65.8% of the world's fish stocks are currently being fished within biologically sustainable levels, and that's down from 90% back in the 1990s. So I think the major environmental challenges that we face in this world are often intensified by trade. Local communities become increasingly dependent on global trade and global markets for income and livelihoods. And global competition intensifies fishing and overfishing. It can be very difficult to think of how we can resolve trade impacts through these trade chapters, which of course doesn't mean we shouldn't use them. And a third contradiction that which I think has already been touched on, is the very specific situation in Mexico and in the town of San Felipe, which has particularly found themselves involved in all these tensions. And then the tensions between the local fishers and the needs of the environment. So to save the vaquita, we want to eliminate gill net fishing or replace it with a method that doesn't catch her as much bycatch. But many fishers will tell you they rely on this for their livelihoods. Alternatives are costly. They can't recoup their costs, and things that DJ was suggesting. Now, there's been some funds for these fishing communities over the years, but from what I can tell, mostly from newspaper sources, it's not enough, and it's never been enough to lead a dignified life. It's never been enough to support finding genuine alternative incomes inside and outside of fishing. And it's also happened during a time in Mexico where there has been a period of austerity. So as the CEC submission notes, the government of Mexico has actually slashed funding to the Secretariat of the Environment and Natural Resources by 28% from 2018 to 2021. So if I was to put that in a global context, I'd say you can compare that to wider tensions around climate change, the future of the planet, interesting parallels to, say, communities that are dependent on the fossil fuel industry. There's a lot of talk these days about a just transition. But in reality, governments and corporations are usually not willing to pay for it, or not willing to pay for it in a way that is substantial and over time to genuinely compensate people for lost incomes. So I'd say that that's the case here with the Vaquita and the totoaba, is that yes, you need more local community buy-in, But I think that what you need with that is a commitment to substantial funding and support for fishing communities. And this includes significant subsidies to encourage fishers to change their fishing strategies, which should be funded not only by Mexico, but the US and Canada and others. So those are my contradictions. And with that in mind, what can the CEC case do? Well, I think it can do lots of really interesting things. It can expose the lack of will on the part of government to do what needs to be done, which is, of course, regulation and surveillance, but also it's about addressing the costs to the communities and the dire need to actually pay those costs. I think a second thing is, if we're lucky, it will open up some doors for accountability, dialogue, and collaboration, and perhaps point to ways that things could be done differently in the future. And third, let's hope it can pressure all three governments in the USMCA to respond more effectively to the situation of the Vaquita and the totoaba. I'd say the case of the Vaquita is particularly urgent and dire. We've known about it for a long time. And I think it's very alarming, not just for the Vaquita, but for what it says about the ability of our governments to respond to the environmental challenges that lie ahead. So I think in this context, we should use any tools at our disposal to pressure our governments to live up to their often grand statements and pledges around environmental sustainability or North American partnership, and see if we can push and do something real and necessary when it's urgently needed. So I'll just stop my comments there.
Gavin, thank you so much. And Sarah, and to DJ as well. An incredible conversation and discussion. And we do have, if people can stay with us, we would like to open it up for questions or comments. And so you're welcome to either use the reaction button, there's a raise hand, or simply take yourself off mute if you want to share a question or comment. The chat box is open too. Mara, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for Gavin's comments. They were really thought-provoking, for sure. And I apologize, Mara, I'll get to your comment in just a second. I do want to say certainly our current CEC petition is putting pressure on the Mexican government, and I think it's deserved in this case. Certainly more needs to be done for the folks on the ground, and you talk to fishermen and you hear the interviews that they're giving, and they're begging for more enforcement. Like the legal fishermen, they want more enforcement to get the cartels out of there, to get the illegal fishermen out of there. So the enforcement really can help the local folks. We certainly are pressuring Mexico here. Canada has been my target in the past, though. Don't fear. I plan to keep my eyes on you. We're not hesitant to call the U.S. out. That my organization's job is almost exclusively to sue the U.S. government. So there's plenty to be called to task for. And U.S. groups can go again. You can use this process against our own government, and are right now. So. It can be used. I agree. It's probably going to be looking at Mexico, in the short term, but it certainly can be used to pressure U.S. and Mexico, Mexico and Canada as well. Please.
It's Rob. Could I ask a question of Sarah?
For sure, Rob. We actually have Mara has her hand up first, and then we'll go to you next. How does that sound?
It sounds great. I just couldn't figure out how to do the hand up business.
No problem. Great. Mara, you want to go first?
Yes. Hi, I'm Marilee. I'm a reporter with International Trade Today. I wanted to ask, what kind of resolution out of consultations do you think would be most productive? Because I believe it was DJ, but maybe it was someone else who noted that seizures at the border, sites enforcement at the border doesn't help the Vaquita that much because the catch already happened.
Yeah, that's been a fundamental problem, in my opinion. I didn't discuss this, but the consumer country of China, they're trying to do their part. They have also had seizures. They have also done inspections of the fish markets and so on and so forth. But frankly, nobody's doing enough. And as I indicated, if you're seizing a totoaba bladder at an airport, the animal's already dead. You're not helping the totoaba, you're not helping the Vaquita, because that fishing has already occurred. The risk has already taken place to the Vaquita as a result of that illegal gill net use. So it's really, we know that the IWC has consistently made recommendations to Mexico to, step up its enforcement. This Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species has adopted 2 sets of decisions at COP 17 and COP 18, seeking additional efforts by Mexico to step up its enforcement and to do other things. Same thing with the World Heritage Convention. And so far, while I think Mexico is, listening to those entities, it just hasn't done enough. We need a much stronger response from all those entities, frankly, to put even more pressure on Mexico to do the right thing and to as we have said in the past, while we think the entirety of the Vaquita Refuge has to be properly patrolled, there's no question that that zero tolerance area, that 225 square kilometer area, needs to be patrolled 24/7, 365. That's the only way you're going to ensure, and it has to be patrolled by officials that have the authority to undertake arrests and are not prevented because of concerns over potential violence in San Felipe and Santa Clara to do so. They have to have the proper training, they have to have the proper arms, and they have to be able to arrest people too. And then there has to be prosecutions and penalties that are of sufficient deterrence to send a message to all the other potential poachers that you just cannot be fishing illegally in the zero tolerance area.
And do you think that the consultations are likely to lead to a program of arrests on the water?
Well, I think the consultations, and Sarah can chime in here, will lead to a factual record that will hopefully get to the bottom of what's going on, because as Sarah indicated, Mexico has a tendency, Mexican government officials have a tendency at all the different convention meetings that I mentioned to share information that is inaccurate or that it's exaggerated. I mean, I was there at the CITES meeting in early March in France, where the delegate from Mexico said, in the last few months, there have been only 2 illegal fishing vessels in the zero tolerance area. That's a flat out lie, and we can prove it. But Mexico has a tendency of doing that. So hopefully with the factual record, once all the evidence is put on paper and, hopefully cut through the smoke and mirrors that Mexico tries to use to pull the wool over everyone's eyes on this issue, that will lead to more stronger or resolutions at these various international conventions and ultimately more pressure on Mexico.
Yeah, and DJ addressed the kind of the CC provision. I think that your question also gets to the environmental consultation under the kind of dispute provisions. And I think, I don't know, but I think that the US went, the consultation route instead of the dispute panel route. I hope to be supportive of Mexico, to say, there is this dispute panel route, there's that threat out there, but what can we do to help you get the right things happening on the ground? You need to do some things, but I'm hoping that it is more of a supportive, probably both sides, supportive and pushy at the same time. That's the route that they took. So I'm hopeful that this time it will make the difference, but we'll see.
Just very quickly, I'd just like to add to that, and I know Rob has a question, but I participated in a World Heritage Convention workshop on this issue a few months ago, and delegates from Mexico requested assistance. They need help. They recognize they need help. They need money. A couple of years ago, Mexico adopted a law that said that all the pangas had to have vessel monitoring systems installed to track them using various programs. And the legal fishers complied with that. They all installed vessel monitoring systems. We now know that since that time, nearly 1,000 of those vessel monitoring systems have been disabled. But the problem is not with the vessel monitoring system, but we learned about a year and a half ago that in order to obtain that data from the vessel monitoring system, Mexico has to pay money to a company called Pelagic Data Systems. Mexico had not been paying that money for 3 years. And so it doesn't matter if you have these systems installed on the pangas. If you're not paying the money to get the data, to analyze the data, to take action against, and to understand, what's going on in the upper Gulf. It just does you no good. And that's an example where Mexico needs assistance.
Gavin, do you have anything you'd like to add to that, or?
Well, I think I'm okay, so that Rob has a chance to ask his question.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Mara, for joining us and your question. And Rob, if you want to unmute yourself, perfect, go for it.
Thank you. I never did find the little hand to put up, but I'll work on that. Anyway, just a very quick comment. Sarah, I actually worked with Sarah Legal Defense Fund a long time ago, and we put in a couple of these submissions under the old NAFTA rules. And actually, I have a better record than you. I think we were 2 for 2 on pulp and paper in Devil's Lake. But
well
anyway,
done, my friend. Well done.
My question is, and I'm sorry, I don't know this, but do you have any Mexican partners on this submission? You do, okay. Because that's huge, and I'm sorry I didn't know that. Who are they?
Well, so I will say, and I should have said that at this at the beginning, I was sort of rushing through making sure we were staying within time, but yeah, I really need to acknowledge my colleague, Alejandro Oliveira, who is down in our Mexico office. He's our senior scientist, who was super helpful in actually drafting this petition. He couldn't be here today because he's off helping file a lawsuit against the Maya train running through the Yucatan today. But yeah, we definitely have folks on the ground, and that's really important, right? We need to make sure that we're saying the right thing and doing the right thing, and that requires consultation with the folks that are in Mexico. So.
And the second, not part of that question, so I'm sneaking another one. I don't see any little hands, but maybe Carrie does, so just cut me off, Carrie, if you do. One of the problems with previous submissions was the submissions were fantastic, or rather the records were absolutely terrific, well researched, well thought out, and really good at finding facts. And although they couldn't make recommendations, often sort of made the inference of what a recommendation should be. But follow through, there was very little follow through after factual records. So my question is, under the new rules, is there anything that promotes follow through on these factual records?
No. And I totally agree. Everything you just said, I think is spot on. I do think that the timelines have been, there's more compliance with the timelines than there used to be, so that records are hopefully going to be more relevant because they will be more timely produced. And I think that has been a problem in the past. I do think, and not because anyone said this to me, but it seems like the CEC Secretariat is moving this particular Vaquita issue very quickly. That's critical. It's urgent. There are only 8 left. But hoping that will make them more relevant. The other thing, when the USMCA was finalized, the US put in implementing legislation. And within that legislation, there's a provision, so this is just US law. It says that whenever the CEC does issue a factual record, that record is supposed to be transferred to the US government, and this body is supposed to decide whether or not to initiate some kind of dispute process. And if they don't, they're supposed to tell Congress why not. So they don't have to, but there's like some pressure within the US law to actually try to give some more teeth to this factual record process. Here the U.S. government didn't wait for that factual record; they just went right to it. But so that is something that hopefully will give a little bit more pressure to and a little more meaning to the CEC factual records. Hopefully that answered your question.
It does, and kudos to you for going the other route as well on the consultation side.
Yeah, we'll see.
All turning everything over. That's great. Gary, do I have time for just one for DJ?
I think Gavin has a response first, and then I see Joseph has a hand up. So Gavin, then Joseph, and then we'll circle back to you, Rob.
No, I've had my say, so you can leave me out, but if there is time, fine.
Perfect.
I was just going to add that as Sarah had mentioned, that the timeline's been moving pretty quickly with the CSE submission, which I think is encouraging. One of the interesting things in the USMCA has been the rapid response labor mechanism, which has had some really interesting results. And I think when you think about the environmental chapter and social provisions in general, there's always that concern that they're designed in a way to be subverted by the politics of delay. And so that's the hope, is that you can push these agreements now to be moved quicker, because speed matters, right? Like they already talked with the Vaquita, oh, there's only 8 or 10 left, so what's the point? Is this new discourse, right? And so, and I think, you know, if you look at the World Trade Organization, they've delayed on the waiver, the vaccine waiver, for almost 2 years, so that now they're saying, well, what's the point of the waiver? And so I think when these social and environmental components can become effective is precisely when we can make them fast. If they're not fast, the politics of delay will ruin, I think, their effectiveness. So I think that should be one of the goals, is speed.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks, Gavin. Joseph, I see your hand is up. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, go right ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Joseph Goebbels. I'm with the Trade Justice Network. I first wanted to say thanks to everyone for the really invaluable information, but I just had a couple of clarifying questions. For Sarah, as she talked about the CEC Secretariat process around the factual record, I just wanted to confirm that the process is ongoing, but hasn't reached the stage where a vote is taken between the parties on whether to create one. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we're at a stage right now where the Secretariat has said we've passed all the procedural hurdles and that there are central questions to be investigated that would, you know, be the factual record would be meaningful. So now the council, so the political body, gets to decide. They're supposed to decide, I think it was in 60 days, and that's July, but I think their next meeting isn't until a little bit after that. So I'm hoping they'll make a call at their next meeting, which I believe is in the middle of July. I will say there's another ongoing submission that the center did on sea turtles in Mexico, and that has been significantly delayed by the council. So we'll see.
Okay. And you mentioned potentially speaking to Canada. Is there anything else that Canada could be doing on this, or like, is your organization already in the process of getting in contact with them? Because I'm sure a lot of people here know of Stephen Guilbeault's like reputation as an environmentalist before this. So how much freedom he'll have to pursue that in the government obviously is an issue, but I think maybe there could be like some openness to having a meeting about that and like pushing on that the government. So that I feel like that could be something really worth pursuing. And I wanted to know if there's anything that like Canadian organizations can help with on setting that up or pursuing that avenue, or anything else related to this issue.
I want to like give you a hug. That's the best question ever. Part of the reason I wanted to do this presentation was really for that. There is so like the you know, there's the like minister level folks that are on the council, and then there's like the people who actually do the work of the council. After I'm done talking, I'm going to hop online and grab that person's name, because that may be someone that you all actually know and have some contact with. But yeah, we just, you know, we don't have a lot of contacts within Canadian environmental groups, so don't really have a feel. We were going to just send like a blind email saying, hey, let's talk. You know, I will say the Canadian government at the CITES meetings tends to be very conservative, like surprisingly so, I would say, on a lot of issues. So yeah, we're not sure how it's going to land on this one. But yeah, I'm going to pop off. I'm going to grab that name and then I'll say what it is. And if anyone knows that has any way to get me in touch, we'll totally take you up on it.
Awesome. And I'm also like, I'm sure a lot of people here would have some useful contacts as well, but like if there's any contacts in the Canadian environmental, like civil society area that we could help get, I'm sure I could help put you in contact with some people that would know more on that.
That is fabulous, Joseph. And I'm sure you figured it out, but you're welcome to share your contact info in the chat box, either directly or to everyone, whatever your preference may be. So as Sarah is grabbing that name for us, Rob, I don't see any other hands. So if you do want to go with your kind of final follow-up question, you're welcome to.
Yeah, sure, I'll be quick. DJ, just a question. First of all, it brings tears to my eyes to see the horrible situation this creature's dealing with, and those racks you showed, boy, oh boy, that was sears into your memory. But one concern I have is just from, you know, quite a bit of experience. The concern about enforcement in Mexico, and you mentioned cartels, and one wonders where the money's actually going for these maws or the bladders, like who's getting it at the end of the day, makes it a really difficult situation to deal with. And I think it was Gavin referred to inequities, et cetera, particularly when you're dealing with Mexico. Has there been any thought to well, I'm sure there's been thought, but has there been any productive thought to alternatives such as having an actual natural marine preserve for these creatures so that they have actual space to propagate and that kind of thing? Maybe physically it's just impossible because the way they migrate or whatever it is they do. I know there's some projects now dealing with whales in that way, you know, not trying to propagate them in aquariums and that kind of thing. Is that a possibility, and is there any thought to that?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, I would say that the Vaquita Refuge and the zero tolerance area represent that type of protected area. I think there's been some discussion about trying to find a way to net off the zero tolerance area, literally sinking nets to the bottom of the ocean so that the vaquita can't leave and they can't, and any that are on the outside can't come in, and somehow that would prevent or help to prevent illegal fishing. I'm not sure that that's the right direction to go. I think there simply needs to be a greater commitment by the government of Mexico, both politically, financially, and otherwise, to ensure that they have sufficient enforcement resources available in the upper Gulf. You know, one of the things that's been real depressing is that after the September 2020 regulations were adopted, which, as I indicated, we thought were a really significant step in the right direction, in July of 2021, they adopted a new set of regulations, which basically are considered sort of triggering factors, sort of a sliding scale of when they would commit to enforcement within the ZTA. And so even though the ZTA is supposed to be this area where no fishing, no vessel traffic, so on and so forth, these new regulations basically say, well, you know, we'll only commit 60% of our enforcement resources if this number of vessels are within the ZTA, or if this amount of net is found within the ZTA. And that's completely going in the wrong direction. So, you know, there just needs to be a fundamental shift in how Mexico is engaging in this issue. And they have to recognize that the ZTA and preferably the Vaquita Refuge are these sort of significantly important, that represent significantly important habitat for the vaquita, and that whatever it takes, and I agree with Gavin, Mexico can't do this on its own. It requires the assistance of the US, of Canada, of China, you know, technical assistance, capacity building, financial assistance. It should be a global effort to try to, in a sense, take that Vaquita Refuge and make it this pristine sanctuary where very little activity is permitted within it, so that the vaquita have a chance of population recovery.
Okay, thank you. I guess what I was getting at, and I didn't express it well, was trying to find a bit of a halfway house to protect the vaquita, but also maybe to give some kind of environmental industry work to replace the netting. So I was just trying to think along this, but thank you, and I wish you I wish all of us the best of luck in protecting it.
Well, I would note that, you know, I agree with Gavin that the compensation issue really needs to be revisited. Several years ago, they instituted a 2-year ban on gillnet use within the vaquita occupied area. And as part of that, they developed a compensation program for the fishers that were affected. I don't remember the total amount of money that was spent in that compensation program, but, you know, it was a troubled program. There was corruption. The money didn't get to the right people. Too much money got to the wrong people. Only the legal fishermen qualified. So the people that were already fishing illegally didn't qualify. So that was a problem. I do agree that some type of additional new compensation program should be implemented while there's a concerted effort to help the fishermen transition to the new gear, not just to acquire the new gear, but to learn how to effectively use it so that they can start to catch the amount of legal fish to make a living consistent with what they were making before. And the other thing I would note is there has been in the past programs run by the Mexican government and by NGOs employing fishermen to go out and collect the illegal and the abandoned ghost nets. And our organizations have consistently supported those programs. As I explained, the fishing method has changed. And so there's not as many sort of abandoned nets out there as there used to be, but it's still important that those programs continue and provide a livelihood to at least some of the fishermen, so that not only can they support their families, but they're out there protecting the vaquita. They're taking out the ghost nets that do remain to prevent them from killing vaquita and other species. And I should just add that this is not just about totoaba and vaquita. We don't have a complete set of data on all the bycaught species over the years, but we're talking other finfish species, marine invertebrates, sea turtles, and even cetaceans, including 2 juvenile humpback whales have been killed in the fishing nets, the illegal fishing nets in that Vaquita Refuge area.
DJ, thank you for that, and Rob as well for the question. And I just see we have a remark and a comment from Fiona in the chat, and she just shares that Canadians generally are very unaware or uninformed about trade agreements, and what are ways that we can continue to follow these issues. And so I wonder, Sarah and Gavin, I'll turn it to you both for closing remarks, and Stu, if you want to send us out as well. But maybe finishing off on, from this, we have the recording, everyone registered will get the recording from today, but what else can we do to remain engaged and informed on this issue?
Yeah, on trade agreements, it's technical, right? Like I do think, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity to sort of walk through them. I wish that more citizens more folks were really trying to use the CEC process and do more about it. I think that it could be really helpful. Yeah, it's a challenge. There's just so much in the world right now. And talking about extinction is for Vaquita, it's a real downer. It's hard to get attention. Just more negativity in the world. So I still have hope. I do think that the Vaquita can survive. Hopefully, folks really committing and paying attention and pushing all of our governments to support the issue can make a difference. Kevin?
Well, yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add to what Sarah said. Obviously, the CCPA works on those issues. It's great that Joseph is going to be in touch with you so that some of the people in the network here can sort of pick up the Canadian side, because it sounds like there's a good chance it'll turn to a vote that Canada will have to vote on. So I think that's great. And beyond that, I think the only other thing I'll throw in there is that we can take these agreements, like say the USMCA, which we all know has investment and corporate power at its heart, and turn it into North American partnerships and ask, what could it look like if we actually say, well, you said it's a partnership, so let's make it a partnership. And I think the Vaquita case that you guys have put forward is a perfect example of how we can try to build those bridges. So actually, thanks to you and DJ and your organizations for all the hard work you've done on it.
Well, and I would just encourage people to, if you're really interested in this issue, reach out to Sarah. We can provide you more information. I'll post my email in the chat in a moment. There's amazing resources online. The Environmental Investigation Agency, one of the organizations Sarah and I work with, they've done multiple reports on this subject, looking at this from the China trade perspective that my organization hasn't focused on. So, and then there's a documentary called Sea of Shadows. I'm assuming it's available Vimeo or one of those streaming services if you're really interested. It provides more information about sort of the involvement of the cartels in this. And it's not just the Mexican cartels. In fact, the Brookings Institute and a person called Vonda Felbab Brown put out a report just a month ago describing how the Mexican cartels are becoming more and more involved in illegal wildlife trade, and they're in effect working with the Chinese cartels, both the Chinese cartels in China and the tentacles of the Chinese cartels that reach out into Mexico as part of this overall network, trying to satisfy the demand for totoaba moths in China. So it's a complex enforcement challenge, but we are convinced that Mexico, with the help of other countries, should be able to take this on.
Thanks, everybody. I won't add too much to this. I just want to thank the presenters again. I learned so much on this presentation, which is exactly what I was hoping for. And I mean, it's just the amount of information from DJ and Sarah. It's fantastic. Gavin as well. I'm sure we're all going to be in touch again after this call to see what else we might do to increase the profile of this plight of the vaquita. And just again, thanks to everyone for coming, and we will be sending this out, putting this up on YouTube as soon as we can. And if people do want to stay in touch on like future webinars like this, you can send me an email at stuart@policyalternatives.ca, and we can let you know next time we do something like this. So thanks again. I don't know, Carrie, if you want to add anything or if we'll end it there. No, okay, we'll end it there. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.